Welcome everyone to this afternoon's Sci-Café session. Welcome to our audience here in Building 1, but also our audience on Facebook Live. I'm John Tanacci, the Director of Research Operations here at KAUST. And today we're going to be talking about communicating science, especially visual communications of science. We'll get started here in a little bit, but I just want to remind you of the format of how these Sci-Cafés work. The idea is for you to get a little bit of feedback briefly on who are the panelists, what's their background, what's their expertise that they're trying to share with you. Then we'll launch into a few questions from me to guide a discussion about visual communication of science. And then it's going to be opened up to you, the audience. And I'm challenging you right now to be ready to ask questions. We got to be able to probe into some of the details of what's initially presented by the panelists. We want to know what is it about communicating science that you're interested in. So be ready to ask those questions. So with that, I'd like to give each of the panelists here a chance to introduce themselves again, introduce their background, introduce their expertise to lay the foundation for our discussion today. So, Daniel?
Thank you, John. My name is Daniel Acevedo. I'm the director of the Visualization Core Lab here at KAUST. What we do in the laboratory, and I will show some examples in my speech afterwards. Basically, we help scientists see the unexpected. When they run an experiment, they get data, they need to analyze it. So to analyze that data, what we do in the laboratory is create audiovisual experiences for them to look at this data and try to understand it. Part of that, we rely heavily on the scientist's expertise to get that insight. They know about their science, and they need to get that data from the experiment and look at it. So I'll show some examples of that.
Perfect. Xavier?
Thank you, John. My name is Xavier Pita. I'm a scientific illustrator here at KAUST. And my work and my teammates' work is to create images that communicate science. So our goal is to work with scientists in order to clarify, simplify, and explain their research through images.
And I promise not to be biased. Xavier is actually part of our team in research operations, so I'll make sure all the hard questions are directed at him. Tamara?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Tamara Jones, and I am the wife of Dr. Burton Jones, who works in Red Sea Research. And we came here to KAUST in March of 2012, and we originated from California. I'm a visual artist, working freelance here at KAUST. My background is in fine art, although I worked many years as a graphic designer, because once I graduated from art school, they didn't teach you the business of art, so I didn't want to be a starving artist, so I found the next best thing, and it was a wonderful experience, and actually, it was that experience that introduced me to Photoshop. And Photoshop is one of the key tools I use in creating my art.
Good. Yeah. Thank you very much. So today is a little bit different than most of the Sci-Cafés. Normally, we are talking about a research topic, a scientific topic here at KAUST. Here we're talking about everything scientific that happens at the university and different ways of organizing it and viewing it. So just to, again, set the stage. Daniel's in the Visualization Core Lab. This is real data. This is complex, big data coming from the researchers here at KAUST, and he and his team have to work to tell that story. Xavier is working with the researchers for journal articles, for intellectual property, for filing patents, for presentations that they give to different audiences. Some of them non-scientific audiences, some of them may be experts in the field. You have to be able to take the information that a researcher gives and translate it to a nice illustration that quickly shows what's happening with the science. And Tamara's coming from a completely different angle. The science, the thing that's happening around KAUST, even the oceanography that her husband works on, that the Red Sea Research Center works on, that becomes some inspiration and becomes a part of how she views the world and creates her art. Okay, so what we're going to do now, the format's a little different. I want each of them, since this is so visual, to take a little time and show you some examples of their artwork, and I want each of them to talk about the process for how they create it. And what you're going to find, I hope, is that they're all creating artwork. They're all following a similar process, even though some of them are heavily engaged in the science and some of them are coming at it from more of an artistic perspective. So you'll be able to see the visuals here on the screens, and I'd like Tamara to start talking about what is that process? What are some examples of your artwork and how do you create it?
Well, first of all, I like to share with you a couple of quotes that have been inspiration to me. And interestingly enough, two of the quotes come from scientific people, but they very well relate to both, worlds of science and art. First one is from Max Planck. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. I thought that was a very, very good take to heart. Albert Einstein stated, "The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science." And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Daniel Pink's book. I'm sure some of you are. A Whole New Mind, Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future. And his one quote I pulled from there is, "The future belongs to a very different kind of person with a very different kind of mind. Creators, empathizers, pattern recognizers, meaning makers." So with that, my world is in the arts is basically a world where I have a system of elements that are part of the art world, which would be line, shape, form, proportion, and line, shape, and form, and then I have also principles that I apply to make all of these things work. So within my pieces, I enter that, but the problems I need to solve is with both the elements that I have in creating my art and then the principles. How do I apply those to create the piece that I have? I'm a digital artist, but I'm also originally my studies were in painting and sculpture, and so my digital art tends to be very painterly in its approach, but I am exploring the medium of the digital to express similar things. So when I open up and you look and go, wow, that doesn't look very much like an art piece, but it's actually my husband shared it with me, and many times as I'm doing my artwork, we're just home and I'm looking over his shoulders and I see his data sets, and I said, wow, that really looks like some cool art stuff, and I love the colors you're using and all. And so he explained, yes, I use color, line, shape, form, all these elements of art to describe different variables, like currents and direction of currents, time, space, just all these things. So these are just some schematics that a colleague of us has created to give you an idea. So with that, the first piece I have is a picture of digital work from the mangroves. When we first came to KAUST, I was walking along the mangrove beach, and I saw the little scrubby bushes and everything. And when I went in and took a closer look, I began to see, wow, this is interesting. I have all this life and just teeming with life and things like this, and so I began to just spend some time in the mangroves. And this one particular morning, I was really struck by the vertical lines of the mangrove roots, as opposed, contrasted by the angular lines of the shadows that were cast because of the morning sunlight. So I took a few snaps and shots with my iPhone, and when I headed back to my studio, I thought, well, how can I express what I just experienced in the mangroves? And so I came up with this piece, and if you take a closer look, that's that's how it looks close in a lot of detail. And it was interesting because my husband, in looking at that, said, "Oh, that is just what scientists like. You know, at each level of scale, there are interesting details to be studied, and this is what I found was interesting. I also used to contrast. I used complementary colors, orange and blue, which really bring a brilliance and a brightness to the piece. And then these textures to just add kind of a crispness and also intrigue people to look closer, because that's what I ended up doing with the mangroves. I looked closer. Let me skip over. I'll come back to this one. Then I also went out at dusk and more in the evening lights, and I get a whole different feeling of what it was like being in there. And to express that, I switched my digital palette to a more analogous palette where I'm using blues, yellows, and greens. Becomes very soothing, and which was that time of the day. I'm still using a lot of that detail that I have in my other picture, but I bring in a whole different mood just by what color I use. The lines are still there, this time softer, not as strong as the previous piece. Then also with this piece where I have the sunset, which is a softer light. There's still some strong yellows and oranges, but they're all analogous colors more. There's some complements in there, but they're used to not to the vibrance or the strength that I used in the first piece. They're more of a subtle kind of a use of that to give it just that soft evening glow. So that's, and then I also, this is another piece I created, Daylight Through the Thickets, where on one of my hikes I was walking, and then I observed there was just some bushes and trees that were just coming up, and then the light was coming out from behind them, and it was just bringing out a brilliant in the greens and the trees, and just sparkling effect for the branches and the trees below. And again, with this, then I used elements of just line and color, and the top portion becoming shapes of dabs of green and oranges for the leaf and foliage, and then the light that sparkles through the tree. And this is still another piece where I'm using line and movement, very dramatic, with a lot of angular lines, creating sort of triangular shapes. And I'm going to skip down to also. This is also, I stop at just about everything. It drives my husband and my son crazy when we're on vacation, because I got to stop and take a picture of this. But I found that the bark of the palm trees had fascinating patterns and textures to them. So this is just an example of one, and what I created as just what inspired me to create digitally with that. Then still another example of a bark, and what I did with that one, just adding line and color and shape. And again, this is a digital piece. And then I went further in creating more shapes, which I actually am very interested in eventually going and doing more three-dimensional pieces. Since I was interested at one point in sculpture, I was thinking, now this is a way that I could use the digital, but also create three-dimensional pieces with it. I don't know yet how I'm going to do it, but I'll figure it out. This is still another piece where I'm using elements of texture and patterns, and I call it's the ocean flows through it. And when my husband looked at this piece, he said, wow, that reminds me of NASA's, I don't know if any of you have seen the Perpetual Ocean. We have the video clip of it, so maybe later after our talk you could take a look if you have time. But it just shows all of the currents all occurring simultaneously around the world. And of course, some of that also even looks like the Starry Night from Van Gogh. But my husband especially thought, wow, that just sort of reminds me a little bit of that water that's flowing through your piece in the center of the piece. So interesting. And now this one is one of my paintings. And I've been working on trying to work out some new concepts and ways of the way I approach my painting. And this is basically where I use liquid acrylic with a mixture of medium and water to have it just flow across the canvas. Some of it I control, some of it just happens serendipitously, and it's very interesting, exciting, the interaction I have with my paint and working on that on the canvas. This is another one, I also use sponges, and sometimes I use like a plastic wrap and other tools to sort of create some of the shapes that I have, and so those are a result of that, and I'm working on some more pieces along with that. So this is a piece that didn't quite work well, and I went in to Photoshop and just started playing with some of the textures and designs, as well as this one, which is a scan. I took a picture of my painting, put it into Photoshop, and added some additional treatments to it with the patterns and designs. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said, you're going to get 3 of these mini presentations. That was really on the visual art, and now Daniel's going to talk a little bit about the process of how do we take complex data, often with multiple dimensions to it, and create something that we can understand visually.
Thank you. Tamara mentioned a few things that we use, and I think when I present now what we do in some examples created by the team in the laboratory, we use the same elements. We all use, and Xavier probably will show the same thing. Scale comes into play a lot when we work. So I will hopefully link that back to what you just said. You still have more pieces there. All right. Okay. Before we go to that, what I wanted to show is that a little bit of the process of what we go through when a scientist comes over and says, I have run this experiment, or I have collected this data out on the field. I need to look at it. I really don't know what's going to happen. I have some ideas, but I really need to explore it. Exploration is really what we do. And the first thing that this example that I'm going to show from Professor Ibrahim Hotait here at KAUST, I'm going to use it as a driving example for some of the points that I want to make. They came to us. We've been working with them for years now, and they had this simulation of a storm. It's actually behind us. And they wanted to see, the first thing that they wanted to see is like, well, does my model work? I don't know, I ran this in Shaheen, the supercomputer. We need to test whether the model is actually accurate. So the first thing is, okay, we simulated a storm, but it actually happened in 2015. Can we compare that to satellite images and see whether it tracked? So we put them side by side. On the left is the satellite image, and on the right is the resolution of the model. And it's like, hey, look at that. Well, in the last time step, when the storm was already formed, it really tracked. It was in the position that it actually happened in reality. So that was a good result. They wanted to do that. But once we got to this, then the scientists, as they are, they started asking more questions. And they, wait a minute, I have all these data that I calculated. So can we look at that data? So we created an interactive application for them to look at. and they were looking at the rain and the clouds and all the things that happen during a storm, and then they started asking more questions, and that's when it gets interesting, right? Because some of the questions, yes, we can answer quickly and we can interactively play with those variables, but then some of those we need to start. Okay, how do we represent that? And this is what, linking back to Tamara, she has an idea of what do you want to do, what do you want to show, but then what elements do you use to represent that? And do we have to think the same thing? What elements, what visual elements or interactive elements do we use to be able to give the scientists the tools to answer the questions that they have? So, for example, they wanted to look at how material, how movement of particles happens during a storm, right? So we created a way for them to look at how the materials spread throughout the storm in the different heights, in the different layers. So we colored the layers differently. We had a whole complex system to figure out how the layers moved around. And they were great. They were happy with that. They were able to analyze and actually see and confirm that the model, yes, is still, the transport of material is still correct. It follows what it should. So our model is actually tracking that correctly. Now, here we have a first example of, well, the elements that we choose could be these, could be those. What do we choose? What is the right thing to do? And the answer for us, from a visualization perspective, there's not right answer. There's many different ways of representing data, and what do you choose depends on the question, depends on where you look at it, depends on whether you have people, other scientists discussing this, so we have to adapt to those things. So there are many components that makes us choose the elements that we use to represent the data. We had that. This piece was created by one of our scientists, Tom Teusel. We have that, and then they said, okay, put it together with the rain and then the clouds that we had at the beginning. Can we look at this? And we put the particles in there, and they started thinking more and more about this. And it got to a point that they actually wanted to look at the circulation, how is the particles move up and down in the eye of the storm. So here we have an image of same particles colored differently. So same elements that we had before, just picking different colors to represent a different variable. And here, up means, the red means up, the particles move up, blue means they move down. And you can see that in the eye of the storm is not single circulation, they're up and down movement. And that's interesting, and that's something that they like to see, that they actually model, pick that up, because it's a complex process that happens during the storm. Another thing that they wanted to do, well, let's look at the velocities of the wind in the storm. So we cut the storm in half, basically, with this plane, and we show the lines of equal velocity. So what I wanted to show you with all these examples is that variables are there. There's a lot of stuff that they calculate, or in this case, they calculated, but in other cases, they have all this data. And there's all these tools, all these things that we can put together, and which ones do we put together is critical for them to understand the data and to actually move on their research. Sometimes it's our responsibility for them not to get stuck in something. If I choose the wrong colors or the wrong elements, I might get them stuck in something, and I'm not a scientist to be able to decide that. So it's a very collaborative process. We might get to images like this. This is the same data, same storm. It just looks spectacularly dramatic to me. I don't know, is the vortex of doom there? The whole Indian Ocean is on fire. I don't know. There's something happening that it shouldn't. This just comes from the data. And doing this, they might draw attention to something that you might not want the scientists to be looking at. Right? Or the scientists might not be interested in that particular effect.
Or vice versa, they may see something that they had never seen in the data because of how you've chosen to color or bring out the information.
Correct. That's exactly right. Thank you for bringing that up, because that draws to my point in a few slides ahead. When they're looking at this, one of the key elements that we bring up is not just the visuals, is the interaction. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now to go to a different example. We have been working also with Professor Pierre Magistrati and his group on brain and brain physiology and how functioning of the brain and the neurons and the structure of the neurons, etc. So they they use interaction as the main tool for them to discover. They get the data from the microscopes, they slice it, and they do the reconstruction. Their group does the whole thing. They come to the laboratory to use these facilities, the virtual reality facilities, because that gives them that extra thing. They don't have a preconceived idea of what the structure of the brain is, and when they get here, it's a complete blank canvas.
So what are we looking at in this particular image?
So in this image, Professor Magistrelli and Dr. Corrado Cali, they're looking at glycogen nodules. So they're looking at how different structures in the brain transport energy, basically, from the blood vessels to the neurons, right? And they have all these slices that they take, the actual
So this is from real brain tissue?
This is from brain tissue from a rat. It's a tiny piece, I think a couple millimeters across. So it's a tiny, tiny piece, and here they're inside it. So changing that perspective also changes the way scientists approach to the data. So again, going back and summarizing a little bit, I have a couple more slides, but just to keep you in the loop, there's color, there's different elements, the different things that we can do to represent the data, but it's also the interaction and the scale that you put things in. Sometimes the data gets really, really complex, right? For example, this is from the same project, also from the brain project from Professor Magistrelli, but these are neuronal structures, and this is a simulation, actually. These are a forest of neurons that was simulated as if it were in the brain. This is really complex. You could think this is a mess. It's really difficult to understand something. So sometimes this happens. You create visualizations, and it's difficult to see something in there. So you change the perspective, and you bring them, okay, let's put them, instead of a flat wall, that image before was this wall that you have there on the right, let's put them in VR, in virtual reality. Same thing, but they can navigate through it now, and they're inside it. So that change, you hope that it brings something. But the point of these couple images is the fact that data, real data, is really messy. It's really difficult. It's raw. You don't get clean data ever. That's just a given in our profession. It comes like this. Again, changing gears, another project. These are deposits in a membrane. Biological deposits in a membrane. So this is what we get, and they try to analyze that. There's all these little pieces floating around. How do we make sense of this? So that's the idea of this image, to show that this is what we have to deal with, and we have to present it in a way that the scientists can actually answer or ask some questions in there.
But just because I'm a science nerd, I want to make the connection here for the audience. This is biofouling of a membrane,
Correct.
And it's the initial stages of biofouling, which is critically important to understanding how much energy and how you're going to clean a membrane for desalination, for example. So the visualization, being able to see with this detail and understand the data, allows you then figure out cleaning protocols or mechanisms of preventing or minimizing that biofouling. So this one visual image could have a huge impact in developing desalination technology.
That's great. That's exactly what we try to do. We try to combine this visualization with the actual analysis that the scientists are doing on the side. So visualization is very, very powerful when it's combined with statistical analysis, or all the types of analysis that they need to do to actually get the data out. But this would give them clues. Oh, they might find something interesting. Let me give you another example. This is a combustion simulation run on Shaheen. So this is really messy. This is really complex. There's a lot of things going on in there. We're looking at the tendency, we're representing here the tendency of the flow to rotate.
Basically, something's burning,
Basically.
and this is what's coming off of the minor explosion.
Thank you. That's pretty much it. So in here, they try to look at how does the turbulence evolve with the combustion. And if we zoom in, there are different structures in there, and we humans, we're very good at picking up things and making correlations and spatial correlations. So as a visualization scientist, we rely on that too, on the perception, on the fact that the scientists can actually make correlations when an analytical process might be very difficult to program to actually pick up those things. but visually you immediately pick something. Here there's larger structures there on the top. There's very tiny structures in the center. Well, that says something.
But soot formation, CO2, all of these factors of combustion can be understood to a certain extent if you can model this minor explosion. So again, there's a direct connection exactly to what the scientists are looking to solve.
Correct. This goes back to the point that you made before when you said, well, they might not be paying attention to something, and through a visualization, you might actually draw attention to something that might be interesting. This actually happened in this case. They were looking at silt deposition. So this is, imagine an estuary, and then there's salt water and fresh water joining together, and the silt actually deposits in a certain way. So modeling that, through images like this, they were starting to look at those little swirls that happen. They know that they were happening, but they weren't paying attention to them. And the fact that when they look at this, it's like, well, maybe we should study those swirls more, because they seem to have an effect on the way silt actually deposits along the thing. So just creating this visual might just give them that clue to a different experiment that they didn't think of before. Just to finalize, basically, when we have all those elements, we have picked something to represent the data, we put them in the right space, maybe on this large wall in there, we give them the right interaction for them to look at the data. Sometimes it happens that it just clicks. I remember talking to Tamara before that sometimes she says that, right? She puts things on the ground and is like, well, I'm not going to work on this anymore. And then she walks back, she looks back at the paintings on the floor and is like, oh, wait, I didn't think of this angle. And then goes back to paint. Here it's the same thing. Sometimes you don't think you're going to find something, but sometimes it just clicks, right? And then you get into an environment, and then you look at that messy data, but then there's something interesting that you pick up. And that's what we rely on. We rely on the scientists picking that up using this.
Thank you, Daniel. All right, so you've got a few minutes. Make sure you're ready with questions. These are a lot of images, a lot of information, but we want to hear what you might be interested in digging into a little bit further after Xavier gets a chance to speak. So again, I was struck by how the images that were shown in these first two mini presentations were similar. Just the pure artwork looks a lot like the data, and what we perceive and what we can get out of that information is impressive. Xavier is taking a different angle. What have the scientists figured out, and how do we tell that story most effectively?
Exactly. So after the hard work of the research, which involves a lot of time on data visualization, that these examples that you showed, after this, the researchers, the scientists have conclusions, results, then it's time to communicate them. So this is the last step of the scientific process, and it's an important step to get that information to the audience. And I want to show you some examples of what scientific illustration can do and how it can communicate science results of research, and also show you a glimpse of the process involved in creating one of these images. So I want to start with showing you these two examples and show you how a scientific illustration here on the left can show you things that cannot be seen. So processes that happened at the atomic scale. And on the right, we have a very complex timeline, and with scientific illustration, we can distort time and arrange all of these elements in one image that gives an immediate reading. We can also depict in a very detailed manner experimental setups, including using transparencies, section cuts, whatever visual tools we need to show the information. And on the right side, this is an image that it's actually a concept, a representation of a biological process. So this simplifies and clarifies information. So Daniel was talking about how real data is often confusing and it's a mess. And after the research have figured out what it is, we can take all of that and create a much clearer illustration, something that conveys that message in a more efficient way. We can also use diagrams to simplify information, making it more easy to understand, more readable. and also bring together in just one image a lot of different elements related to each other and highlight how they all are interconnected. So I was talking that I want to show you a glimpse of the process of how we work, and I want to talk about this illustration. This was done for Himanshu Mishra, and he was working with hydrophobic sand, and he was using a thin layer of sand over the soil, and he was studying how it affected water evaporation and what implications that had on the growth of tomato plants. And this image started with something like this. So these are the results of his research, or at least some of the results. And he felt the need to explain this in a more visual, more direct, more effective way. So we met, and he explained me the research. I know nothing about the research. I don't know what he's doing. So he's explaining me what they've done, what are the results, and what's the message that he wants to convey with this illustration. And at the same time, I'm starting to doodle and do some sketches, figuring out strategies to explain that. And after this, we start working and together. A lot of the work is done by me, but we need input and feedback from the researcher in order to design an illustration. And at this stage, our biggest concern is how it's all structured, and if it's readable, if it's understandable, and if the illustration can stand on its own. And we're solving visually little problems about the message. So we want to compare two different scenarios. One scenario with sand, another without sand. So we want to use a visual solution that allows this comparison. So no perspective, putting things side by side at the same level. We want to show things that happen underground. We want to show the roots. We want to show the water flow. So let's use a section cut. But we also want to see that thin layer of sand. But it's too thin to really tell. So let's use a zoom in. Let's use all this different visual vocabulary that we have available and to make the message more clear. And then after this is well established, we can go into the final art and really start rendering the image and adding color and adding texture. And this is also information. But as a consequence, this creates an image that also has a lot more depth and generates a lot more interest. So it becomes more appealing. And this is also something that we take into consideration when we're creating an illustration, is making it appealing. This is part of the communication process. We feel that communication is more efficient or effective if people are drawn into it, or drawn into the illustration. And then if you have designed it to convey a clear and immediate message, then we're going to have a very efficient delivery of information. And this is about it. So,
thank you very much. Again, I want to open it up for questions to the audience, but I'm hoping you can see how each of these elements are impactful in their own way. These are helping researchers tell stories. They're helping researchers find stories. In other cases, they're just demonstrating what's out there in nature, what different elements can be communicated. So as an audience, what are you interested in learning about? What questions do you have for the panel? Oh, I gave you so much time. Yes?
It's for Xavier.
Yep.
What is your background, and how did you get interested in scientific illustration?
Okay. So my background is actually from civil engineering. Thank you.
For those who can't see it, that was the president clapping loudly.
So I have a 5-year degree in civil engineering. I work as a civil engineer for 10 years in the fields of geotechnical engineering. And in the meantime, almost 1 year or two after I started working, I realized I really liked drawing. I had to do a lot of drawings as an engineer. And I developed the taste to explain things visually. So that was part of my original job, but it became a little more than a hobby, and I have a master's degree in scientific illustration and have worked as a freelance before having this fabulous opportunity of coming here to KAUST and to work.
Good. Any other questions? Yes. Wait for the microphone, yeah. Thanks.
How do you visualize the quantum mechanical system? For example, back in our electrical engineering, when I was a student in 1993, we took in modern physics, I'm not sure if this is still modern, but we talk about the double slit experiment, which is the electron passing through the two holes at the same time, which has the superposition of states as a particle and a wave. How can you visualize this to a normal man who can see two states at the same time? Thank you.
I'll leave that one to you, Dan. No.
Daniel,
I think what he's asking more broadly is how do you take information that is hard to perceive with how we perceive information? I mean, we don't think of two states at the same time. We can't understand superposition. So how can the Visualization Core Lab help explain something like that?
So we start with data, right? We start with something that was calculated or someone obtained on an experiment. So is that something, I don't know the physics, I don't know the science in this case, is that something that can be modeled? Is there a cyclotron or something that actually generates data that explains that process? Or can you model that process in a way that you can obtain some information? Is there a model of that process that?
Of course, there is a Schrödinger wave equation.
So yes.
Which
Perfect.
Models that in three-dimensional complex
Perfect.
wave. But this is the mathematical part. If we talk physics, now what is the nature of this? Because in microscopic universe, it is very weird.
Yes.
And it breaks the whole laws of our classical mechanics or classical physics.
That's fine.
And that's why this is how quantum computers work, when they have
the dual state. I understand.
The dual states at the same time.
Correct.
It sounds like you have a project designed for the Visualization Core
We
Lab,
need to
is what you're
talk a
saying.
lot.
I'm not.
It's fine. I dealt with.
In that.
I dealt with. I did in grad school. I did a project in visualizing four-dimensional structures and things like this. So I'm used to weird things. It was very strange. Exactly. The fact that we were in a cave in a VR environment was easier because instead of on a screen you have one more D. You're closer. You're only one D away instead of two Ds away. So that was a theory. It
was that a visualization joke?
Yeah, someone did that in grad school. Yes.
Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
You hear me. So, I was wondering if you use any data extraction or feature extraction techniques in parallel with your the visualization technique, if I can. Because we know that the brain can make connections.
Yeah.
It can, for example, see complex structures in very complex data, but not every time. And at the same time, when we extract features and we have patterns, it is able to make connections where algorithms can't.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, are you using them in parallel with this virtual stuff?
Yes, absolutely. Once we get the data, there's many related variables that you can get. You get a set of variables that they have calculated or something they have created. And then you can create all these secondary variables, which would be, feature extraction or dimensionality reduction, and then you get this principal PCA, some stuff that you can visualize, and you can combine that. One of the things that we need to be careful, and we discuss this in the group a lot when we work in the project, is be true to the data. We just say be true to the data. The data that they give you, you can manipulate it, you can work with it and try, but make sure you make those connections back to the data, because if you go too far, you might lose the scientist, and the scientist might not trust you in dealing with those transformations. So as long as you keep those transformations, as you say, feature extraction or something like that, yes, but we need to explain that visually or interactively in a way that is very clear that that feature that you're seeing was extracted through these processes, through these algorithms from your raw data. So yes, we do that often.
My second question is, do you really think using this complex, huge, multidimensional data for scientists are really important when we know that many data are redundant and just few factors are interesting? Mm-hmm. Isn't it like more interesting to ask the scientists in advance to make any analysis like sensitivity analysis and take more interesting features or factors and reduce the data, because they think that big data is the best science, but do you really think it's interesting to waste time and money on all this when we can do better with few data?
Okay. That last part kind of threw me off. When they bring the data, they can bring all that. They can give us. We're not the scientists in the field that they are the physicists or molecular biologists. We're not scientists. We don't know that science. So they need to explain it to us. When they bring that data, yes, they can bring all the, hey, don't look at this. These are outliers. They can tell us all that. In fact, our process is very much interactive with them to actually understand what is the question. Right? When they give me the USB stick, I say this often, many times when I give these presentations, they give me a USB stick and they say, visualize that. And I'm like, no, I can't. I don't know what that means. I really don't know what that means. I'm asking, what do you want to know? What is it? What is the question that you want to ask this data? Right? And then that starts telling me, they start telling me, well, this data is all this, and then, by the way, these are outliers, don't look at those. It's up to him or her. Right? It's their data. So, yes, we try to get all that information as much as possible to minimize the exploration. Yeah.
I want to, before we take another question, I want to go back to Tamara on something she and I were talking about earlier. A lot of what we're focused on here at KAUST is science, but I think as data improves, as information improves, you and I were talking about how the skill sets for artists may become very, very important in the future. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah.
I think it's the same that as Xavier and Daniel are seeing in their fields.
Yeah. This is, I've been just sort of thinking through what we're going to be talking about today. I came across a gentleman, Mario Vahe, and he's a visualization expert from the Swiss National Supercomputing Center. And he made some interest, he has a whole paper which had a lot of interesting aspects of things to look at. But I pulled this out because I thought this really tied in with our discussion. And he starts out by saying, Leonardo da Vinci was a scientist and he was an artist. Many qualities of a successful scientist and a talented artist are the same: creativity, intuition, willingness to throw out the rules, close observation of nature, ability to see patterns where others see chaos, knowledge of human perception, being aware, need to communicate something abstract, either emotions or numbers, the use of aesthetics to capture the audience's attention. So I think that kind of
actually, I don't mean to cut it off if people have additional questions, but I think that might be a perfect ending to this entire session. And I want to hammer home this point. I think there's plenty of time afterwards for you to go on a few tours of some of the core labs, for you definitely to discuss with the panelists. So please take that time to come ask your questions if you didn't get a chance. But I hope you were struck by this connection between science and art. I think it's a very KAUST message to say that as we do science in the 21st century, we have to be crossing all of these disciplines. And I think it's a positive statement about KAUST that we have all of these people in the community. And for the scientists that are out here, for the faculty, the researchers, come make use of what Daniel and Xavier, come make use of these resources. It will make your science better. And let's not forget that artistic view, that perception that Tamara is talking about is part of the scientific process that we use every day. So I think this is an amazing combination of what's here at KAUST. I hope you enjoyed the Sci-Café, and please thank our panelists.
Thank you.